Hello, everybody. Welcome to class. Today, we are going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, measurement. And how do we measure the world around us? How do we come up with the numbers? But also how do we use qualitative approaches to help with this measurement? So it is mostly an extension of our quantitative analysis. Um, and so it's almost a prequel, if you will, to quantitative analysis, just to how to figure out how do we come up with those numbers and come up with those ways of measuring. So let's dive in. Now, your textbook does not address this, but one of the major conceptual and ethical um, approaches, I guess, that have been coming about in recent years is this idea of quant crit, um, or critical race theory and quantitative analysis, and bringing a healthy degree of skepticism to our quantitative analysis. And a lot of this, stems from what I have said before in terms of the origins of statistical analyses being used to prove racial superiority. And now we're trying to debunk that, but it has all kinds of huge implications for racism and feminism and various other isms. And so, how it is that we include people or don't include people, who is marginalized according to what understanding of the world, has profound implications. And so, this is not just pure science by any stretch of the imagination. And so, the reason I put this actually first, rather than as an afterthought, is I want us to carry these principles and these ideas with us through the whole chapter itself. So, with all of that, one is that racism is central, and we need to center it in our understanding. Then, two, numbers are not neutral. I mean, you can't just say, um, well, the quantitative data, um, yeah, we gathered it, but what data that you gathered is, reflective of the interests and the assumptions of white elites. And just to go back to the centrality of racism, this has, uh, you know, generally there is going to be a bias in favor of maintaining racial status quo. Um, Number three, categories are neither neutral nor given. And as you have heard me say before, when we read race, then we need to really understand it as racism. Okay, so this, it assumes a fixed quality of a person, um, or that they lack it, and that's not true. These are constructs that are um, important for all of us to keep in mind, and that it's a socially constructed, um, yeah, a socially constructed idea. So you can't just say, well, due to race, we see these differences. No, it's due to racism that we see such differences. Data cannot speak for itself, um, and so, or themselves. Um, it is open to interpretation, and therefore we want to understand, what are the different assumptions that people are bringing to it, and as well as then to bring those different voices to the interpretation of that data, to understand, what does it mean. Uh, and then finally, we want to use numbers for social justice. And so this has, we want to critique and reject false and self-serving notions of statistical research. It is not value-free, but there is bias. It is not politically neutral. There are agendas that seek to prove certain things, but it's really seek to justify actions that people have already wanted to explain. So this information I got from a research seminar that I attended at the Society for Social Work Research. It comes from a book by Gilborn, Warmington, and DeMark. So just wanted to share some of that information as a supplement to this lecture. So, with all of that, bringing our full social justice and critical selves, we want to talk about concepts. Well, what is a concept? It's this mental image that, we use to summarize observations or concepts or ideas. Uh, Earlier on, when you were taking a look at qualitative themes, you were doing some coding and you were creating some themes, and so you were creating some of these ideas and constructs in the abstract, and so that's really kind of the same thing here. And so we have these concepts. It may be very difficult to measure them, but then we come up with certain questions or statements to see to what degree do people agree with these. And then we can have some semblance that if we ask these right questions in the right way, in the right series, then we are able to get a semblance of this concept and how it measures. And so conceptualization then is the working out of what do these terms mean in research. And so, yeah, so that's how we want to think about concepts and such as depression or financial well-being or stress, uh, family wellness. What do these things mean? How do you measure them? That's what all of this is about. So when we go from understanding, okay, we've got this concept of depression or this concept of financial well-being, you can't really see it, but there are certain things that you can see, or there are certain things that people can tell you that they feel. And so this is the operationalization. And so this is that process by which we um, how we measure this concept and what indicators might we use, determining which are valuable, which are better indicators or worse indicators, and how do we assign value to them to be able to rank, is a person better or worse in depression? Do they have depression, or is there a cutoff that determines like, no, with this score, you don't really have depression, you just feel a little blue. So how do we assign all of these values and these metrics to then be able to determine that, in fact, a person does feel a certain way in a certain concept? And so, as I suggest here, we use scales. And so this is a measure, say on a sum or an average of responses to a series of questions or statements that they respond to. And so that then creates a measure. And so I think it's important for us to understand here, you can have items. And so that would be, a single line that you are responding to, such as in the past week, I was feeling really angry. How many times? One time, 10 times. Okay. So that would be an item, number of times that you felt angry in a week. Then you have maybe number of times that you had difficulty sleeping, number of time or the severity of these outbursts. So when you add up all of these different items, they look at different measures and different aspects of depression, and that then is your measure. So you have items are the individual pieces, and then the measure is the whole piece unto itself, the whole survey. Now, you want to make sure that each question, or item that you ask may or may not be measuring the same concept. You want to make sure that they are all measuring the same concept and maybe in different ways, but they are all leading to one concept of depression or one concept or understanding of financial well-being. And so some of these scales or questions may, may form subsets. So you may have two or three questions that focus on a person's ability to sleep, two or three questions that focus on a person's social relationships and ability to go to work. Another could be, you know, difficulty regulating their emotions. So these could all be, kind of subscales or subsets within the larger measure. Um, and some can be actually better questions or more important questions than others. And, so how much they weigh, there could be some difference there. It may be less important to understand how a person sleeps than how a person relates to other people. Who knows? Now, we've got a lot of different types of scales. There's different ways of measuring these and coming up with a number. So you've got the Likert scale. This is, measuring the extent to which a person holds a particular attitude or feeling. You're probably very familiar with those. So say, you can then sum or average the scores across different items. So one item could be I believe that learning statistics could be of a huge benefit to my career. Do you strongly disagree? Disagree? Are you undecided? Do you agree or do you strongly agree? So we see, kind of a wide range there from strongly disagree, that has the least number, so that's a one, and then it goes up incrementally all the way to strongly agree. So we've got a range there of responses that a person can choose from. Then another type is the semantic differential scale. And so this is where you've kind of anchored less by a particular number, but more just simply on a binary happy to sad. So statistics makes me feel happy, or does it make me feel sad? So they can kind of choose where along that line that they would fill, and then they would indicate that probably with a number. And so they rate themselves based on those opposite words. Then there's the Gutmann scale. And so this one's kind of more of a cumulative. And so you check as many, from the kind of the most basic to the most comprehensive. And so with this, it can be, strength of an attitude. And so you can say, well, I like food, I like eating out, I like going to restaurants, but I'm not so good so much on, going to international cuisine restaurants. So I might check only the first three. Or I might really love going to international restaurants and especially Italian ones. And then, oh, the local cuisine in Venice was amazing. And so I'm going to check all of them. So it goes in greater and greater degrees of sophistication and nuance. Then one of the things is we need to understand how do we conceptualize all of this to then turn it into a variable for our broader measurement and understanding and statistical analysis. So, you can have, say, a treatment of depression. Maybe you're engaging in some sort of talk therapy, and you're trying to figure out, hey, maybe I've got this new form of talk therapy that I'm going to compare to my old form of talk therapy. So, with all of that, if you are going to do that, then you have to really explicitly detail everything about that treatment and what makes that treatment unique. And so, you need to be able to really describe all of that as so that it can be fully understood and replicated. That's the important piece. So you're describing this intervention in detail so everybody's clear about it and how it's distinct from your treatment as usual, or the TAU, as it's sometimes abbreviated. When we want to gather this data, whether we are simply using a measure or we're trying to construct a measure, there's different ways of getting that information and getting the data. One is to use simply direct measures. So, if we've got a measure for depression, then we use that scale. There could be inference measures. So this could be, some more of the qualitative where perhaps we do interviews, or there could be, we hand the scale to somebody and they take take a measure for themselves and then hand it to you, or maybe they do a questionnaire for you. Whereas the direct measure might be more, I do it for the individual. Um, then you've got the previously collected quantitative data, and so this sometimes is called secondary data sets. So a lot of government bodies or large research bodies will spend huge amounts of money to be able to do research and gather data, and then they'll make it open and free, oftentimes for researchers then to be able to use. The benefit here is that these are large. They are representative of the U.S. population for the most part. So, and they've got a lot of different types of questions. The problem then is that you oftentimes weren't the researcher who picked those questions. So you're kind of at the mercy of what are the questions that are available to me. Then there are data that are derived from primary documents. So it could be written records or clinical documents, administrative data, things like that from an organization. And then there's the unobtrusive measures. So we've talked about just simply observing but not engaging with a client. And so there could be maybe past traces of behavior and content. Maybe you scan social media accounts for examples of different forms of data where people don't know that you're actually gathering information about them. And so when we combine measurement operations, if you remember in one of our previous lectures, we talked about this idea of triangulation. And this is really important. So that way we can begin to actually have an understanding that, yep, this is what we're understanding. So for instance, with the measure of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, I know that three people have to fill out the questionnaire or the measure, the evaluation. And it's a person's doctor. It is perhaps the family member or a parent, and then maybe for a child, someone in school. And so then they compare so the teacher and the parent and the doctor, and they compare all of the scores together to see, yep, are we seeing this consistently across all these different domains of life? Um, and so therefore we're able to, coming from those different ways, we're actually able to see then yes, we do have sufficient information. So using two or more different measures of the same variable can be really helpful as well. And so it, helps to make it more accurate using these multiple sources as well as methods to draw conclusions. So, perhaps you're not all using the same measure, but you're using different ways of measuring it. So that can be ways in which we can go about it. Next, um, it's in, as I mentioned, we have qualitative research and methods. And so, we have that inductive approach towards developing concepts where you have your interview transcript. And so that's the data is collected, and then you look over it, you review it, and then you organize it using the codes and then the themes to then craft perhaps a theory of what's going on. So that is how you go about that measurement in qualitative research. Now, in quantitative research, we use our numbers, and there's different ways of measuring those. So perhaps you've been familiar with this from statistics class. You've got your nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio levels of measurement. So the nominal level is really a qualitative one. You're simply looking at a category of having to do, say, with a person. There's no number that's inherently associated with it. You just simply might use it as a way of coding. So, such as a country of origin. How do you rank that? Difference between, Canada and the United States. There's no number associated with it. It's just simply, you are from that country. Now, Sometimes, we'll also use racial identity as a level of measurement or gender. So these are also nominal. They having to do with simply it's a name. Okay. So these are often treated and measured as nominal. However, there can be underlying problems with this. So um, when people say there's something, difference according to gender or differences according to race, then we get into some of the problematic understandings of this. So, so they are not necessarily neutral, but how we quantify them, um, there can be challenges there. Now, notably, that when we have these levels of measurement, they have to be mutually exclusive and exhaustive. So, for instance, when we go back to racial identity and gender, how do you have a mutually inexclusive racial identity? Well, a person can say they're white, or a person can say they're black, but if a person who is white and black, you know, how do you measure that? Because if they're a biracial child, or we want to legislate and say that gender is binary, except there are people who don't ascribe to that and don't have that feeling. And so perhaps they are, it is not a mutually exclusive, but it might just simply depend on the day or how they're feeling. Um, or that there's a third other feeling that they have in their identity. And so these are not, to simply then say gender is mutually exclusive as being, male or female, and that is exhaustive. No, we know that's not. And yet we still treat it as a nominal level of measurement. So with that, we are expanding our understanding and are expanding our quantification of that. Um, Now, you can count them though. So you can, depending on your level of awareness of these differences, rather than just simply picking, say, race, and it's a matter of pick one, a lot of surveys now are saying pick as many or check the boxes that apply to you. And so you can pick a range of different racial identities that you ascribe to and that you identify with. So you can pick white and black and Asian, um, and so there's there's different ways in which we count them, but we see very quickly how social justice concepts are have a huge bearing on this. Next, we have the ordinal level of measurement. This is a quantitative one, so meaning that there are numbers that are associated with them. These are not just arbitrary categories. And they are assigned in a specific order of magnitude. So this can be going, from that Likert or Likert scale, from very dissatisfied to dissatisfied, neutral, satisfied, very satisfied, and you assign a number one, two, three, four, or five with that. They need to be mutually exclusive. And what you can do with it then is that you can make greater than or less than statements associated with it. So you, as a social worker, can measure client satisfaction using, using this scale. So that's a way in which you can do it. Then we have the interval level of measurement. Again, quantitative. Here you've got these fixed measurement units and an order of responses. And at the same time, the gaps between the numbers on the scale are meaningful. The difference between, how do you measure the difference between very satisfied and satisfied? I don't know. It's a four versus a five. But what if somebody feels like a little bit more towards very satisfied, so the gap between the number on an ordinal scale is not very meaningful. Whereas with an interval, it is. So you've got a much wider range often of numbers that you can use. So for instance, with the perceived stress scale, uh, this is, goes from ranges from 0 to 40. And you've got three different levels then within it. So 0 to 13 would be low stress, 14 to 26 is moderate stress, and 27 to 40 is high stress. So you have clear cuts between these. And so that these have been statistically analyzed to determine that yes, of anything between a 14 to a 26 would be moderate level. And so you can kind of look at those different levels and make those statements. And then you've got the ratio level. So for instance, age, if you have simply the number of years that a person is old, then that would be a ratio. This is where there is a fixed measuring unit with an absolute zero. So you can be, 0 years old. Maybe you've only been around for a couple of months as a newborn. Um, Now, this level of measurement is what you can do the most with in terms of manipulating it and comparing it and so forth. So one way use of this could be, for instance, if you have counseling sessions and you're measuring the discrete number of times that a client attended over a certain period of time. So over 6 months, maybe they attended 0 sessions, no attendance. Maybe they attended, upwards of, 1 to 5 sessions. So they had moderate attendance. And then if they measured, 10 sessions, then it could be, say, high attendance. So so it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can count all of them, and they're all distinct units. And zero, importantly, is an absolute unit itself, and it is a countable unit itself. Now, then there are sometimes dichotomies. And so this would be a variable with only two possible outcomes. Either something happened or it didn't. Um, and so one of the ways in which you can count this is, did a client experience eviction? Yes or no? You know, it's you didn't sort of experience eviction. There's no kind of range of eviction that you experienced. It's not something you can quantify. I had a 4 in my eviction, but it's either, it's a binary. So it's a dichotomy, and we oftentimes will measure that as a 1 or a 0. So that's how we measure those. Now, we try to measure then these variables at the highest point possible, so that it'll provide then the largest number of statistical and analytic options. So um, to the extent that we can do them at a interval or ratio level, that's going to be better because then we can do more comprehensive statistical analyses. Sometimes you can only use an ordinal analysis. So, typically we want to have them be higher rather than lower on that scale of nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. Then there is measurement error. So we need to understand this as well. And so this has if you have systematic error, this is where you have like, some bias that can happen. And so you need to be, mindful of that and aware of it. And then there's just, and that's what you bring to it. And so it's happening in a way that can be minimized. But then there's just going to be random error. And these are some of the unpredictable things in terms of, the outside environment and how it affects all of us. And this is, I think, one of the differences between social science research and some of the harder sciences with greater levels of specificity, because, you could measure physics with a much, much greater level of specificity rather than the difference between two people and their levels of depression. You know, the two people may have very different levels, family experiences and life experiences and environmental factors that are all having, an impact. Whereas measuring, something in the realm of physics, you can control a lot more of that. So some of these systematic errors, the stuff that we try and address within the measuring itself is for instance, social desirability. And one of the things that they have noticed is that People wish to appear more favorable in the eyes of the interviewer. So as somebody knows that they are being studied or knows that they are being interviewed, it changes their behavior and it will change their responses. So we want to try and ask questions in a way that will allow them to, to respond as freely and as naturally as possible. We then have the acquiescence, where you've got the tendency to agree or disagree, where you're hiding your true feelings. And so, um, you know, there's that as well. Leading questions. So, did you find this session helpful? That is a leading question because you want to, it leads you in the direction of finding a session helpful, then you'll say, yes, I found this session helpful. So that is a leading question. And it's also a sales tactic. Um, so the language, influences the direction of the response. And then you've got then the differences, perhaps simply based on worldview or experience or culture, that can impact the errors. And so, for instance, you can ask a question such as, it's easy to get a good paying job in the United States. And one group of folks here in the US may say, yes, it is very easy. But another group that's been experiencing, systematic bias and racism would say, actually, no, it's not easy to get a good paying job in the US. So depending on, their gender, their age, their experience with oppression and marginalization, that is going to impact their responses. Alrighty. Now, we're transitioning a little bit here. We're going to talk more about, the nuances of measurement and how do we know that what we are measuring is in fact accurate. So there's two basic concepts. One is this idea of reliability. The other is this concept of validity. So we'll talk about reliability right here. This is where, um, we want to know, are we consistently reliable? Is it always measuring the same way? So, measurement, it, always provides real equivalent or similar scores when what the phenomenon is not changing. So, we can take a measure multiple times and we're always seeing the same score. So is it reliable in that way? Um, Now, there's different types of ways in which we do that. You've got the test retest, internal consistency, and then there's some alternate ones. Um, the test retest is, how closely related are these measurements in a fixed, at two different points in time? Is the scoring consistent? So maybe you measure it once and you get a 0.7, but then you measure it again and it's a 0.8. you know to what degree is that consistent? Well, those numbers are different, but if that's on a full scale of 0 to 100, and zero point 0.8 versus, or a 0 to 1, I should say, and 0.7 change to 0.8, that's not a whole lot. I mean, that's a 10% difference, but can we get it closer? um and this is assuming that nothing has actually influenced, a person's depression or, whatever is the point of interest. Okay. Or in that they're not being affected by the testing conditions. Then you've got the internal consistency. So, how closely related are these, separate measures, or the items, how closely are they in measuring that single concept? So if we've got four questions that we're asking to get at this understanding of depression, how consistent, between those four questions, are they all leading to depression? Um, One of them, there's a measure that you may come across called Cronbach's alpha. And this is a way of measuring the internal consistency of these different items. And so, typically it would be, say, a zero point 0.7 would be your minimum for adequate consistency within a measure. Higher than that is better. Sometimes you'll even get to a zero point 0.9. Lower than that, it's kind of like, so there's kind of an arbitrary cutoff, but basically zero point 0.7 is considered to be good enough. Um, so one of the research projects that I undertook was to take a look at money habits and attitudes. And so we had three statements in particular that looked at this concept of status and a person identifying with status in money terms. So we had three statements. One of them is, I will pay more for a brand name that others will recognize. The second one is, I'd like to give gifts more that come from a special store and have a brand name or look expensive. And then I will hide the fact that I'm having money problems. Even if I can't afford it, I will spend money to keep up a good image. So these are, three different statements that get to this concept of status. How well do they represent status? How well do they work together? So that is part of the measurement of reliability that we needed to assess. Then you have, say, alternate versions. So how closely do the responses to similar questions correspond? And so you might have a slightly different measure. Um, yeah. And then, so the higher, um, so if you've got some of these similar questions, such as, um, paying for a brand name that others will recognize, having a brand name that looks expensive. So are those measuring, consistently close? If it's higher level of reliability, the better then the scale will be. And then there's has to do with the person who is administering the scale. So between two different people, this is the inter-rater, you have different observers. They use the same instrument uh, and they rate the same phenomenon. How well are they rating the same phenomenon? Are they coming up with consistent scores? The more consistent, the better. Or the more similar the scores, the better. Because then we know that it's the measurement that's actually, working well. Because lots of people are going to be using it. So we want to make sure that it's measuring consistently. And then you've got the intra-rater. So for one individual, they are assessing somebody at two or more points of time. So this would be more of a longitudinal. So if you are a therapist and you've got a client, you want to measure their level of depression at the very beginning, at the intake, and then maybe a couple months later, and then a couple months later, and then a couple months later after that. And so, how consistent is this observation over time? Um, as far as a measure goes, is it reliable that, if you know that the person's depression has not gotten better, then we should actually see that within the measurement. And so the more consistent, the better it will be. Next, as I mentioned, we have validity. So this is the extent to which, we can be measuring consistently, but are we measuring consistently the right thing? That is another concept here. And so you've got both the measurement and then there's the construct. So here the measure is what we're looking at. And so this is the extent to which it's measuring what it's supposed to. Are we confident that this measure, appears valid, just on the face value of it? Does the measure cover the full range of, maybe a concept and how it's understood by experts in the literature? So one of the things that I did was I've looked at this idea of financial precarity or financial vulnerability, as it's sometimes called. Now, most researchers, they would say, all right, well, maybe it has to do with, your ability to come up with $400 or $2,000 in the event of an emergency. And I said, well, okay, yes, how much is in your bank account helps, and that's an important indicator, but that's not all that, relates to a person's sense of precarity or vulnerability. There's also a very subjective element there to it. So does it cover the full range of everything that needs to be there? And, is it even being defined in the right way? So there's a lot of work that can be done in terms of that content validity. Then you've got the criterion. So are the measures scores similar enough to the scores of other related measures of the same phenomenon? So, this is a way of kind of doing a compare and contrast. If somebody else has already done a similar type of measure and you're trying to come up with a new one, how well does it compare to the old one? And so this can be, either in terms of the concurrent, and so you can do both measures at the same time, or you can do it as a whether, if it's going to be, predicting behavior in the future. So it can have both ways there. Now, for the construct validity, that's on our next page. This has to do then, with the idea, the concept. Okay. And so is it related as a measure to other measures that are relevant in that theory? And so, this is based on the theory. Is our measure similar to others? So, are we measuring financial well-being or depression or stress in the same way as other people have measured it? Um, the discriminant validity is then the scores of one measure are compared to then the scores of other related, but a different concept. Um, if you've got the convergent, this would be, kind of an association between two measures of the same construct, maybe using two different measures and methods. Maybe you've got known groups. So does your measure correctly assess score differences between groups, specifically, for understanding the differences in the phenomenon being measured? So maybe you've got, you're trying to compare between women and men. Does it measure the same way when you know what the outcome should be? And then there's factorial validity. And so has to do with how the items, so the individual statements in the measure relate to each other and then to the overall score. So to look at and see a little bit about that, we've got a crazy diagram there. And so this has to do then with um, my dissertation. So this is coming up. You have then, this is an example of a structural equation model, which used a factor analysis to come up and determine how good were some of these individual statements. And so first we did an exploratory factor analysis and then a confirmatory factor analysis to see, how does this idea of financial precarity work? And does, simply looking at those objective financial strain, such as, ability to come up with $400, how does that relate to subjective financial strain and, to the overall understanding of financial precarity? Well, we can see that they are related. Um, but one of the things I did found was that I had selected some, items, and some of them worked well, and others did not work well. So ultimately, I ended up taking some of them out, which did not work well. I even had one, interestingly, where such as uh, a large drop in income. So this was J10, and let's see here. Let me bring up my laser pointer. J10 is right here. And J10 contributes pretty well. Okay. It's a zero point 0.5. Typically, you want at least a zero point 0.4. If you can get higher than that, that would be great. And I've got others that are zero point 0.8 and so. But J10, a large drop in income, I was thinking, well, that's something that's measured. That's something that's objective. And so I initially had that over on the objective side along here. But one of the things I found was that it actually worked better because it's not so much how much a person's income dropped, but a person's perception of that income drop. Was this something that was a travesty, or is it something that's more of a blip and a hiccup? So the perception was actually more meaningful. And so it actually did better, once I moved it over to the subjective side. Uh, so with all of that, there's other metrics for determining how well all of this works together. But you have these individual line items, and then they all contribute to a certain concept. So here we were looking at financial self-efficacy, and I used certain items that I thought contributed to this concept of financial self-efficacy. Yeah. Now, notably, one of the things that you also want to do is make sure how well does this work across cultures? Does it work the same across different groups? And so I used this model to see how well does it work for white folks? How well does it work for black folks? And so, divided it up by those who had identified themselves in one group or the other. And what I found was that these questions actually worked really well for white folks. They did not work well for folks who identified as Black. So that was a really important learning for me and a big warning that, hey, as I'm trying to understand to what degree does some of this subjective behavior impact the racial wealth gap and people's willingness to invest money, then you know what? I need to come up with a better measure. And so this was a really important finding for me. Now, there are ways in which we can improve this reliability. So one, as I mentioned earlier, was just simply taking out certain questions that are problematic or certain items that do not work well, or maybe you have to move them to a different portion of the measure. Otherwise, you have to really get into your qualitative approaches. So there, you can, use respondent groups and surveys, conduct interviews about how people think about them. So these are important qualitative approaches. And so a lot of times we'll go back and forth between the quantitative side and the qualitative side to determine, how well do these statements all work, and then testing them out and seeing what people think of them. Now, one of the things that we've done, when I was talking about interval and then ratio, is this idea of a cutoff score. And so this really, when we are thinking about a clinical context, it's important to be able to have a distinction between, well, how do we know a person has depression? According to what criteria? What does, a certain score of 7 versus 14 versus 30 mean in the context of depression? So we need to figure out what those cutoff scores are. And some measures simply don't have those. And so that's, kind of a caveat. But this would then be a defined presence or absence of a particular condition when you have those scores. So, we determine it by comparing the scale and, how a scale is ranking people to when we actually know that, it's happening. So this would be, say, comparing it to an individual and their own therapeutic diagnosis, where we say, okay, I know this person has depression. Now let's see how it ranks on this scale. And so you test the scale against when you know somebody has depression, and then when you know somebody does not have depression. So there's, kind of different ways in which that can pan out. So you've got a true negative. So this is where both, using your scale and your clinical evaluation agree that nope, the person does not have depression or does not have the condition. A true positive would be then the opposite, where both the scale and your clinical evaluation agree that, yeah, this person has a condition. Then you've got but you at the same time is like you want to minimize, some of these false negatives or false positives, where there's a disagreement on the diagnosis, where the scale and the evaluation don't agree. So you're trying to get them as close as possible. Now, when we talk then about sensitivity, this is really kind of that proportion of true positives. Because, as people, we're complex, we're varied, we are not the same. And so it can be difficult to measure this. And so, there's going to be a degree of variability, but we want to minimize that variability. And so using our best therapeutic diagnosis, we compare the measure and its ability to accurately confirm or deny the presence or the severity of the condition when we know what the outcome should be. So sensitivity would be measuring the true positives. Specificity would be measuring the true negatives, and how many are truly true negatives and how many are truly true positives. So all of this, now we're getting back into some of the diverse society, but we've been talking about these social justice issues. So when we have this conceptual equivalence, a lot of this has to do with, does the concept differ across cultures? So a concept, does it have the same meaning? Are there the same precursors and consequences that relate, And does it relate to other concepts in the same way? So, for instance, when we're studying family, we say, um, is how difficult is it for you to care for your family? Well, the definition of family can be very culturally dependent. For some people, family might mean a very nuclear sense. So, a mother, a father, and, two kids. Well, ability to provide for those four people would be very different than, say, somebody whose concept of family extends to aunties and uncles and cousins. And so you've got, something that's a little bit more amorphous and is much, much larger. What's their ability to care for their family? That's different because there's also a lot of cross care that's happening. So in terms of the responsibilities that are there and one's ability and it all boils down to one's definition. So is the concept equivalent? So when you use that word, does it mean the same thing? This has big implications then in terms of policy because they say, well, you can only, we're only going to give you SNAP benefits or nutrition benefits for your family. Well, it's only for those four people. Meanwhile, for these bigger families, the fact that they're sharing their wealth and sharing their food with other people, that's not taken into account. Then there's the operational equivalence. So is this concept evident in the same way? And so we're measuring it the same way. And so, for instance, measuring depression, um, the different cultures may have different manifestations of it. So one feature of depression could be a lack of appetite or could be poor sleeping. But in some cultures, that may not actually be a relevant indicator of depression. It may just simply be something else. So how you operationalize it is important. The items need to have the same meaning across cultures. One of the things that I looked at with the financial well-being scale was, they had this one item. Would giving a gift for a birthday or a wedding provide a hardship? Well, for some people, spending, 25 or $50 on a gift for a blender or something like that might be perfectly acceptable. But for other cultures, that would be woefully inadequate. And so a gift would have to be in the hundreds or thousands of dollars. So depending on your culture, how you determine gift would actually have great variation. So, even within a certain item, they would have different meaning across different cultures. Then you've got the scalar equivalence. And so, does high versus very high mean the same thing or have the same level of intensity or magnitude across different cultures? Now, with all of that, then um, it's then best or better that we be consistent, because no measure is perfect and we got to work with what we've got. So what's going to be important then is that you use it understanding these differences, understanding these nuances, and when you are working with a diverse clientele, you use it consistently the same way within a group or ultimately within one person rather than trying to compare groups unless that's very specifically what you're setting out to do to try and improve the measure. So you don't want to use it kind of across groups, but rather within a group, unless you know that it works consistently and it has been tested and shown to work consistently. So that's what we call invariant, meaning it doesn't change depending on whatever group is taking it. So that's where measurement invariance becomes a really important test. And so ultimately, when we are talking about evidence-based practice, sometimes, is it easy for a person to, and is it worded in such a way that it's easy for a person to take and do the measure? So is it time consuming? Can they do it as a self-report or, does it have to be through an interview? Cost, is it affordable? A lot of times, you have big psychological organizations or companies that, have a scale or such as like the Myers-Briggs scale that costs money to administer. And so is it cost prohibitive or is it free to use? Then there's the sensitivity. Can you pick up on changes in a person over time? If you can't pick up on the changes, then it's kind of, pointless. Um, do the measures influence, the responses that people provide? So you want to make sure that they do not influence it. So that's the reactivity. And then is it acceptable? I mean, ultimately, do we see value in how well, and what this is measuring? Are the people who are administering it, actually determine that's useful and helpful? So they may say, it's not so helpful. It's not showing, the full scope of what everything is going on, or it doesn't, actually it doesn't do it for me, basically. So that's the acceptability piece, of the people who are administering it, and they see the value in it. So there may be different ways of measuring depression, and you may actually favor a particular type of measure because you feel like, what, this actually gets at everything that I'm seeing. So, with all of that, that is our discussion on measurement. I hope it has been helpful. There's a leading question, and I will see you then next time.